The days turned into weeks, and Caleb and Zitkala continued their journey through the desert, moving farther into the wild, unexplored parts of the land. As they traveled, the bond between them grew stronger. What had started as a simple act of saving a life had transformed into something deeper, a friendship, perhaps even an unspoken partnership forged by the desert's harsh demands. There were moments of peace in the desert. Nights under the stars were quiet and beautiful, the fire casting shadows around them as they sat side by side, sharing stories of their lives before the desert. Zitkala spoke more freely now, her voice lighter, her face less guarded. She had begun to let her walls down, allowing Caleb to see the woman beneath the warrior. She laughed more often, and Caleb found himself smiling more than he had in years. But the desert was never easy. The landscape was unforgiving, and there were always dangers to be mindful of. Sandstorms that could sweep in without warning, wild animals that prowled under the cover of darkness, and the ever-present threat of running out of water. But together, Caleb and Zitkala had learned how to survive. They were a team now, each relying on the other's strengths, each offering what the other needed. One afternoon, as they rode across a dry, barren stretch of land, the air thick with heat, Caleb noticed something different in Zitkala's demeanor. She was riding more slowly than usual, her gaze distant, her brow furrowed with thought. Caleb could tell something was weighing heavily on her mind. "Is everything all right?" he asked, pulling his horse up alongside hers. His voice was gentle, a quiet concern behind it. Zitkala didn't answer immediately. She simply kept riding, her eyes on the horizon, the landscape stretching out in front of them like a never-ending sea of dust and rock. Caleb waited, giving her the space she needed to gather her thoughts. He had learned that sometimes it was better to wait for her to speak, rather than push her into a conversation she wasn't ready for. After a few moments, Zitkala sighed and turned her gaze toward him. There was something in her eyes, something that Caleb hadn't seen in a while. It was a look of resolve, as though she had made a decision, one that had been building inside her for some time. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low but steady, "about what comes next, about what happens after all this." Caleb didn't speak at first. He had a feeling he knew where this conversation was headed. They had both been running from their pasts in some ways, Caleb from the loss of his family, and Zitkala from the destruction of her people, her tribe. But the desert couldn't erase their histories. It couldn't erase the pain they carried, the scars that ran deep. "I'm not sure I'm ready to face what's waiting for me out there," Zitkala continued, her eyes focused on the ground as they rode. "I'm not sure I can go back to the world I once knew, the world that took everything from me." She paused, her voice tightening. "But I can't keep running either. I don't know if I can keep living in the shadows forever." Caleb could feel the weight of her words. He understood. He had spent so much time running himself, never allowing himself to heal, always afraid that if he stopped, if he let his guard down, the pain would consume him. But the desert had taught him something he hadn't expected. It had taught him that running wasn't the answer. Facing the past, accepting it, and moving forward was the only way to find peace. "I've been running too," Caleb said quietly. "But maybe it's time we stop. Maybe it's time we face what's ahead, together." Zitkala glanced at him, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing his words. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or a kind of quiet surrender. Caleb couldn't tell for sure, but he saw the vulnerability there, the hesitation, and he understood it. She had been through so much. Trust didn't come easily to her, but she had trusted him before, and she was beginning to trust him again. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice softer now. "But maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe it's enough to just keep moving forward, one step at a time." Caleb nodded. "One step at a time. That's all we can do." The rest of the day passed in a quiet, comfortable silence. They rode side by side, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air, but without pressure. The desert was still vast and empty, but for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing down on him. He had never imagined that one day he would share this journey with someone, least of all someone like Zitkala. Yet here they were, together, moving forward, each carrying their own burdens, but no longer alone. That night, as they sat around the fire, Caleb noticed something different in the way Zitkala held herself. She was more at ease, more present in the moment. The tension that had once gripped her seemed to have loosened, if only a little. And for the first time, Caleb saw a glimpse of hope in her eyes, something that had been missing for so long. "We've come a long way," Caleb said, his voice thoughtful as he stared into the fire. Zitkala nodded, her gaze fixed on the flames. "We have," she said softly, "and we still have a long way to go." Caleb smiled slightly, the flicker of the fire dancing in his eyes. "We'll make it together." The silence that followed was comfortable, not awkward. It was the kind of silence that came from mutual understanding, from two people who had shared their deepest wounds and were now beginning to heal. The fire crackled softly, and the night air cooled around them, but for the first time in what felt like a long time, Caleb felt at peace. The next morning they packed up camp and continued their journey. There was no grand declaration between them, no promises made. But there was a sense of purpose in the air, an unspoken agreement that whatever came next, they would face it together. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time they both felt like they could handle whatever came their way. Zitkala had once been a lone warrior fighting for survival. Caleb had once been a cowboy, alone in a world that had left him behind. But now, they were something more than just survivors. They were partners, an unexpected alliance in a world that had tried to tear them apart. And together, they were stronger than they had ever been alone. The days that followed their quiet evening by the fire brought a new rhythm to Caleb and Zitkala's lives. The tension between them, which had been thick like the desert heat at first, began to ease. While they still didn't speak much, there was a quiet understanding between them, a sense that they were no longer strangers but two people bound by shared silence and pain. Caleb was beginning to realize that this woman, this Apache warrior, was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was tough, resourceful, and fiercely independent, yet she had let him into her life, even if just a little. Zitkala's wariness didn't disappear overnight, but she was no longer avoiding his gaze or making sharp remarks. Slowly she began to trust him, little by little. She shared her skills with him. How to find water in the desert, how to track animals in the wild, and how to navigate the unforgiving terrain. Caleb, in turn, taught her how to care for the horses, how to read the signs of a storm brewing on the horizon, and how to make camp in the most efficient way. Neither of them expected to learn so much from the other, but they did. Their bond grew in the most unexpected of ways, through mutual respect and the exchange of knowledge. They traveled together, moving from one part of the desert to another, following the paths that Caleb knew so well. Yet each day the desert seemed different with Zitkala by his side. Her presence changed the way Caleb saw the world around him. It was as if the land itself had a new meaning, one that wasn't just about survival but about a connection that went beyond the barren stretches of earth and sky. One morning, they set off earlier than usual. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Caleb noticed that Zitkala was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. She was still her strong self, but there was something off in her expression, a kind of sadness that lingered in her eyes. Caleb knew better than to push her, but he could sense that something was troubling her. As they made their way through a narrow canyon, the wind picking up dust from the dry ground, Caleb decided to break the silence. "What's on your mind?" he asked, keeping his voice soft and calm as though he had all the time in the world to listen. Zitkala didn't answer immediately. She continued riding for a few moments, her eyes scanning the horizon, the sharp edge of the canyon wall stretching high above them. Caleb could feel her hesitation, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply waited, letting the silence stretch out between them, until she finally spoke. "I've been thinking about my family," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the desert, "about what happened to them, and to my people." She took a deep breath, her gaze hardening. "They didn't deserve what they got. None of us did. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had known that her past was filled with pain, but hearing her speak of it so openly brought a new weight to the conversation. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't need to. Sometimes just being there was enough. I know what it's like, Caleb said, his voice softer now. To lose everything. To watch your world fall apart. Zitkala didn't reply at first, but she glanced at him briefly as though taking in the truth of his words. Then, after a long moment of silence, she spoke again. It's hard to keep going sometimes, she said, the sadness in her voice cutting through the stillness. I don't know if I can do this anymore, fight, survive. What's the point if we're just going to lose everything again? Caleb understood the depth of her pain. He had felt it too, though in his own way. The emptiness of losing family, the loneliness that came with being forced to keep moving even when the heart ached for rest, but he also knew that giving up was never the answer. I know it's tough, Caleb said, his voice steady. But you're stronger than you think. You've made it this far, and you've done it on your own most of the time. Zitkala didn't respond right away, but Caleb could see the weight of his words sinking in. She had been fighting alone for so long, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to anymore. For the next few days, Caleb noticed a shift in Zitkala. She was more engaged, more present, as if his words had given her a new sense of purpose. She was still the fierce, independent woman she had always been, but now there was something softer in her, something that wasn't afraid to lean on someone else, just a little. Caleb could see it in the way she looked at him, in the way she began to share more about herself, her tribe, her people, the life she had once known. They were sitting by the fire one evening when Caleb noticed the change. He had just finished cleaning his rifle and Zitkala was preparing the evening meal. As she worked, Caleb watched her, his thoughts drifting. He admired her strength and resilience, but he also saw the vulnerability she kept hidden beneath the surface. It made him wonder, had anyone ever truly seen her? Had anyone ever cared for her the way she deserved? Zitkala, Caleb said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. She glanced up from her cooking, meeting his gaze. You don't have to do this alone anymore. You've got me, if you'll have me. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Caleb held his breath, unsure of what to expect. He wasn't used to saying things like that. But there was something about Zitkala that made him want to offer her more than just protection or help. He wanted to offer her something real, something lasting. Zitkala paused for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she set down the pot she had been holding and walked over to where Caleb sat. She didn't speak at first, but she reached out and took his hand, her grip firm though not harsh. I never asked for anyone to take care of me, she said softly, her voice full of quiet strength. But maybe I don't have to fight this fight alone anymore. Maybe I can trust you. Caleb felt a surge of relief and something deeper, something he hadn't expected. He had been uncertain, wondering if she would ever allow herself to lean on him. And now, in this simple gesture, she had given him more than he could have hoped for. I'll be here, Caleb promised, his voice steady. Whenever you need me, you're not alone anymore. They sat there for a long while, their hands still joined, the fire crackling softly between them. It wasn't the grand declaration of love or even a promise of forever, but it was something that mattered. It was a connection, a partnership forged in the fire of their shared struggles. And though neither of them said it aloud, there was a sense that something had shifted between them, an understanding, a bond that would carry them forward. Whatever came next, whatever the desert had in store for them, they would face it together. The night passed quietly, with only the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the desert wind to break the silence. Caleb didn't sleep much, though he pretended to. His mind kept racing with thoughts of the woman, the stranger he had pulled back from the edge of the cliff. Her name, Zitkala, echoed in his mind. He had learned it only moments before they sat down by the fire. She hadn't said much about herself, but there was a mystery surrounding her that Caleb couldn't shake. She wasn't just a traveler. She wasn't just someone lost in the desert, desperate for help. She was something more. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Caleb had already prepared the small camp for the day ahead. He had cooked some simple breakfast, hard bread, dried meat, and hot coffee. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep a person going for a while. He set a plate down in front of Zitkala, who had been watching the fire intently, her dark eyes reflecting the light of the flames. She looked at the food but didn't touch it at first. She seemed deep in thought, her mind still somewhere far away. Caleb didn't push her. He knew better than to force someone into a conversation, especially not someone like her who clearly carried a heavy burden. Instead, he sat down quietly beside her, his gaze drifting to the landscape before them. The desert was empty and endless, stretching out toward the horizon. It seemed like a place where time didn't move, where people could lose themselves and never be found again. Zitkala finally spoke, her voice soft but with a sharp edge that hinted at the pain she carried. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe I just need to speak to someone. I don't know." Caleb looked at her, his expression open but understanding. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to," he replied. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." She glanced at him for a moment, considering his words. Then, with a deep sigh, she began to speak, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I didn't always live like this. I wasn't always alone in the desert, wandering without a purpose. There was a time when I had a home, a family. My people, the Apache, they lived in the mountains to the north. We were free, living off the land, hunting, gathering, and sharing everything we had." Her eyes softened as she spoke of her past, a time before the pain and hardship had taken root. Caleb listened quietly, sensing that the story she was about to tell would be difficult for her, but he didn't interrupt. He knew how important it was for people to share their stories when they were ready. "We lived like that for generations," she continued, "until the white men came. They took our land. They killed our people, and then, when there was nothing left to take, they forced us onto reservations, treated us like animals, and tried to erase who we were. My father fought back. He led the charge against them, but it was hopeless. One by one, they took everything from us, our way of life, our freedom, and our pride." Zitkala's voice faltered for a moment, and Caleb could see the pain in her eyes. It was the kind of pain that could tear a person apart. He could feel the weight of her words as they hung in the air between them, the silence that followed speaking louder than anything else. The desert around them seemed even quieter, as if it too was mourning the loss of what she had once known. "My family was killed in one of those raids," she said, her voice a low whisper. "I was the only one left. After that, I ran. I ran far from the reservation, trying to find some kind of freedom, some kind of justice. But everywhere I went, it was the same. The white men, they took everything. The soldiers, the settlers, they don't care about us. They never did." Caleb could feel his heart tighten in his chest. He had heard of the violence and injustice the Native American people had faced, but hearing it from Zitkala, hearing the pain in her voice, it was different. This wasn't just a story from a book. It was her reality, her life, and it was more than anyone should have to endure. "I thought maybe I could find some kind of peace," she went on, her voice growing steadier. "But I don't know if I can anymore. I'm not sure I want to. I'm not sure I can keep running forever." She paused, looking at Caleb with a mixture of weariness and resolve. "I don't know if you understand. I don't know if anyone does." Caleb didn't have an answer right away. What could he say? He had never known the kind of loss she had known, the kind of struggle she had lived through. He couldn't pretend to understand, but he could listen, and that was something. "I can't say I understand what you've been through," he finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I know what it's like to lose everything. My family, my home. I know what it's like to be left with nothing." Zitkala looked at him for a long moment as though she was weighing his words, trying to figure out whether he was just another person who didn't understand, or if he truly meant it. Caleb didn't say anything more, just let the words hang in the air between them, because sometimes silence spoke louder than anything else. After a long pause, Zitkala finally spoke again. "Maybe we're not so different, you and I," she said softly. "Maybe we're both just trying to survive in a world that doesn't care about us." Caleb didn't respond right away, but he felt a shift between them. A small crack in the wall she had built around herself, a sign that she was starting to trust him, if only just a little. She had shared something deeply personal, something that was hard for her, and he hadn't pushed her away. For that, Caleb felt a quiet sense of pride, but also a sense of responsibility. He had offered her help, and she had accepted it, but more than that, he had offered her something rare in the desert: understanding. The fire crackled again, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Caleb reached for his canteen and took a long drink of water, then offered it to her. She took it without a word, her fingers brushing his as she did. There was no need for more words right now. The silence between them was comfortable, and it spoke volumes. They didn't need to explain everything about themselves. They were two people who had suffered, and in their own way, they both understood the weight of that suffering. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat of the desert began to set in, but Caleb didn't feel as burdened by it as he had before. He looked at Zitkala, sitting across from him by the fire, and for the first time he felt like they were no longer strangers. There was something about the way they had shared their pain with each other, something that had connected them in a way that words alone couldn't. Zitkala stood up then, brushing the dust off her clothes. She didn't say anything at first, but her posture had softened, the tension in her shoulders now replaced with a quiet resolve. "I'll stay for a little while," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I won't run anymore. At least not for now." Caleb nodded. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. He didn't know where their journey would take them, but he knew that whatever it was, they would face it together. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt like he wasn't alone in the desert anymore. After Caleb helped the woman back from the cliff's edge, the desert around them seemed even quieter than before, as though nature itself had held its breath during the terrifying moment. Caleb stood there for a moment, watching her closely. She hadn't said much after he had pulled her to safety, but he could see that her mind was racing. The tension in her posture told him she wasn't sure whether to trust him or not. He didn't blame her. After all, he was a stranger, and anyone in her shoes might be just as cautious. The woman was still shaking slightly, and Caleb could see the dirt and dust on her clothes from the fall. Her long black hair, which had once been neatly tied, now hung loose around her face. Her deep brown eyes looked distant as she stared out at the desert. She wasn't looking at him. She was lost in her thoughts, perhaps reliving the moment when she had nearly fallen, or perhaps she was wondering why he had helped her at all. "Are you hurt?" Caleb asked, his voice gentle but concerned. She looked at him then, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was clear she hadn't expected him to ask. She had probably been used to taking care of herself for so long that she didn't think anyone would care about her well-being. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, but Caleb could see the truth in her eyes. She was not fine. There was something deeper bothering her, something that went beyond the fall. The look in her eyes told Caleb that she had been through far worse than what had just happened. Caleb wasn't the type to push people, but he could feel a sense of urgency in the air, as if something had just begun between them that neither of them fully understood. He took a deep breath, considering his next words carefully. "I could help you get somewhere safe. There's a small camp not far from here if you need food or water." She hesitated again, then shook her head. "I'm not interested in charity," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I didn't ask for your help, and I don't need it now." Caleb nodded slowly, respecting her pride. He could tell she wasn't used to accepting help from anyone. It was a trait he understood well, but there was also something about her, something that told him she had endured things far beyond what most people could imagine. She was independent, but not in a selfish way. It was as if she had no other choice but to rely only on herself. "I'm not offering charity," Caleb said, his voice calm. "Just a place to rest for a while if you're willing." For a moment, the woman didn't speak. She stood still, her eyes flicking from Caleb to the edge of the cliff, then back to him. Caleb could see the thoughts swirling in her mind, the battle between her pride and the reality of the situation. She was alone in a harsh and unforgiving land, and while she may not have wanted to admit it, Caleb knew she needed help, just as much as he needed company in the emptiness of the desert. Finally, she sighed, almost reluctantly. "I suppose I don't have much choice." Caleb gave a small nod. He wasn't sure if she meant it or if she was simply giving in, but he was relieved that she had agreed, even if only for the time being. He wasn't about to push her, but the more he looked at her, the more he could tell that this woman wasn't someone who trusted easily, and that was something he respected. "All right then," Caleb said, turning his horse toward the camp he had set up a few miles away. "Follow me." They rode together in silence for the next few hours. Caleb kept his pace steady, not wanting to rush the woman or make her feel uncomfortable. He could tell that the landscape was starting to weigh on her. The farther they rode, the more it seemed like she was lost in her own thoughts. Her gaze would shift from the dusty trail beneath her horse's hooves to the empty horizon, as though she was searching for something she couldn't quite name. Caleb didn't press her for conversation. knowing that sometimes silence was the most comfortable way to travel, especially when one was still processing what had just happened. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, but his mind often wandered back to the woman riding beside him. There was a mystery about her that Caleb couldn't shake. He couldn't understand why she was out here alone or where she had come from, but he had a feeling it wasn't a simple story. It never was in the desert. The sun was sinking lower in the sky by the time they reached the small campsite. Caleb had set it up near a rock formation that provided some shelter from the wind, with a few scattered trees for shade. The fire pit was ready to be lit, and his horse was tied to a nearby post. He dismounted first, then reached out a hand to help her down from her horse. She accepted it, though she didn't seem too comfortable with the gesture, and as soon as her feet touched the ground, she quickly stepped back. "I'm not here to stay long," she said, her voice low as if trying to convince herself as much as Caleb. Caleb nodded. "You're free to leave whenever you like, but you'll need food and water if you're traveling through this desert. It's not an easy place to survive alone, especially after what happened." She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Caleb could see that she was weighing his offer again. The camp was simple, a small fire and a few supplies, nothing fancy. He wasn't trying to impress her. He simply wanted to help her as any decent person would. But Caleb knew better than most that pride could be a heavy burden, and sometimes people couldn't let their guard down even when they needed help the most. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Caleb looked at her confused. "Should I?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head as if she were deciding whether to tell him the truth or not. "It doesn't matter," she said finally, turning away to inspect her horse. "I'm just another traveler in the desert, like you." There was a certain sadness in her voice, a weight to her words that Caleb couldn't quite place. He didn't ask her to elaborate. It wasn't his place. She would share what she wanted to when she was ready. Instead, he gathered some firewood and began to prepare the camp, glancing over his shoulder at her every so often. As the fire crackled to life, the woman sat down beside it, her posture tense but not hostile. Caleb handed her a canteen of water, and she took it without a word, drinking deeply. For the first time, Caleb saw a hint of relief in her expression, like the weight of the desert's heat had been lifted just a little. They sat in silence, the warmth of the fire flickering between them, casting long shadows on the ground. Caleb had no idea what had brought this woman to the desert, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. He didn't know what that reason was yet, but something told him this would not be the last time their lives intertwined. As the night settled around them, the stars above seemed brighter, the desert quieter than it had been all day. Caleb could feel the beginnings of something important taking shape, but what it would become he couldn't yet say. For now, they were just two people alone in the vast desert, sharing a moment of peace in a world that often didn't offer much of it. Caleb Montgomery had always felt more at home under the wide open sky than in any town. Born on a small farm back east, he had known the warmth of a family and the comfort of a home, but all of that had changed many years ago. When he was just a young man, a fever took both his parents, leaving him to face the world alone. His brothers had scattered in search of their own lives, and Caleb had made the decision to leave the past behind. He sold what was left of the family farm, bought a horse, and set off westward toward the wide plains and towering mountains of the Arizona desert. The desert wasn't a place for everyone. The sun blazed during the day, making the land feel like an oven, while the nights were cold and still with the stars burning brightly above. For Caleb, however, the desert felt like freedom. There was no one to judge him, no one to remind him of what he had lost. His days were spent riding alone, rounding up cattle and guiding travelers when they needed it. He had no family, no real connections, just the land, his horse, and the feeling of solitude that surrounded him. Caleb never minded being alone. In fact, he preferred it. It allowed him time to think, to heal from the scars that the years had left on his heart. It was a late afternoon when it happened. Caleb was riding near the edge of a steep cliff, his mind focused on the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, casting an orange glow across the desert. The wind whispered through the cactus and the dry brush, and everything felt quiet, almost too quiet. As he rode, something caught his eye, a figure barely visible against the backdrop of the fading light. At first, he thought it was a trick of the wind or a mirage, but then, The figure moved. It was a woman on horseback, riding swiftly along the narrow rocky trail that led to the edge of the cliff. Caleb squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The woman's clothes were unlike anything he had ever seen before. She wore a mix of traditional Apache dress, a colorful woven shawl and beaded necklace, along with a faded leather vest and pants. Her horse was a sturdy-looking mare, its coat the color of the desert earth. At first, Caleb thought nothing of it. He had seen many people passing through these parts, some traveling for business, others simply crossing the land. But something about the woman's posture, her urgency, caught his attention. She wasn't just passing through. She seemed to be in distress. Caleb, always one to lend a hand, urged his horse forward, hoping to offer assistance. But before he could get close, disaster struck. The woman's horse misstepped, its hooves slipping on the loose rocks near the edge of the cliff. Caleb watched, his heart racing as the woman was thrown from the saddle. She tumbled toward the cliff's edge, her arms flailing, her face filled with panic. The ground crumbled beneath her, and for a moment Caleb feared he was too far away to help. Without thinking, Caleb spurred his horse forward, urging it into a gallop. The wind whipped through his hair as he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the woman who was now teetering on the edge of the cliff. He could see her desperately reaching out, her fingers brushing the air as if hoping to catch something, anything, to stop her fall. Caleb knew that he had only seconds before it was too late. With a final surge of energy, Caleb's horse lunged forward, bringing him alongside the woman just as she lost her balance completely. In one swift motion, Caleb reached out, grabbing her arm as she began to fall. The woman's weight pulled him off balance, but Caleb held on tight, struggling to pull her back. The woman was strong, but so was he. She cried out, her voice shaky and filled with fear, as he managed to haul her up from the edge of the cliff, both of them tumbling to the ground in a heap. For a moment, everything was silent. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the world seemed to pause. Caleb lay there, his heart hammering in his chest, his arms still holding on to the woman. She was breathing heavily, her face pale with shock, but alive. Slowly, she pushed herself up, looking around as if trying to understand what had just happened. She was looking at him now, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Caleb sat up, brushing the dust off his clothes, and then extended a hand to her. "You're all right now," he said, his voice calm, though his heart was still racing. The woman didn't take his hand right away. She stared at him for a long moment, as if measuring him, weighing whether he was someone she could trust. Caleb could see the tension in her posture, the wariness in her gaze. He had seen it before in the eyes of people who had been through hardships, people who had learned the hard way not to trust strangers. Caleb had no intention of harming her. He was only trying to help, but he understood her caution. "I'm Caleb Montgomery," he said, trying to offer her some comfort with his words. "I don't mean you any harm." The woman said nothing for a long time, her breath still shaky. Finally, she stood up, dusting herself off. Her movements were swift, like a wild animal, and Caleb noticed the way she carried herself, graceful but also strong and purposeful. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, something that told him she wasn't just any ordinary woman. "I didn't ask for help," she said at last, her voice rough, but not unkind. She took a step back, her eyes still locked on him. Caleb nodded. "I know you didn't," he said, "but I couldn't just let you fall." The woman's expression softened slightly, though the suspicion in her eyes remained. "What's your business here?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unfriendly. "I'm just passing through," Caleb replied. "I was out riding and I saw you. Thought you might need some help." She tilted her head, studying him closely. For a long moment, Caleb felt as if she could see right through him, as if she were trying to understand not just his words but his soul. She said nothing more, simply turned and began to walk toward her horse. Caleb watched her for a moment, then followed. There was something about this woman, something that pulled at him. She was alone just as he was, and yet there was a force about her, something unyielding and wild. He had no idea who she was or why she had been so close to the edge of that cliff, but one thing was clear. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone who had her own battles, her own reasons for being out here in the desert, and for some reason Caleb couldn't help but feel drawn to her.